Step right up to the Death Kiss Traveler podcast, where I take you to the dark side of amusement, and the stories are darker than you think. My name is Marissa, your morbidly curious host, and this is the only podcast that dives into the horror, history, and hauntings in the places meant to bring you joy. From deadly theme park accidents to circus tragedies to the chilling secrets hiding behind county fair rides, I uncover what really happened and the hauntings that may have followed, because sometimes the scariest part of the carnival isn't the ride. Follow Death Kiss Traveler, where fun turns fatal and the past never stays buried. New episodes on Friday. Listen on your favorite podcast platform.
Research and recording of Canadian creepies happens on the shared land and traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. A key treaty governing this territory is the Dish with One Spoon Agreement. This treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee people binds them to share and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, settlers, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We all share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, meaning we must take care of the land and the creatures we share it with. Welcome, wanderers, to Journey Down the Crooked Path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow. In 1958, Lana Pointing was just 16 years old when a judge sentenced her to the Allan Memorial Institute in Montreal after a stretch of her running away from home and fighting with her parents. Her family was under the impression that she was going to a psychiatric hospital for routine treatments. They were sadly mistaken about what would happen to her while there. Unbeknownst to the public, inside the hospital walls, the staff was conducting horrible, mind-altering experiments. None of that was disclosed to the patients or their families. Lana would be heavily drugged throughout most of her stay. I'm talking for days on end. The staff would tie her down and force drug combinations into her system. LSD, methamphetamines, barbiturates, antipsychotics, the works. Later, she would say that she lost a sense of who she was. Her medical files describe her screaming and fighting during drug administrations. She would even become pregnant during her time at the Institute, and she had no idea that it was happening. She gave birth to a son without understanding how or when she conceived. When she left the Institute, she had several gaps in her memory. She didn't understand what had been done to her until decades later when she obtained her records through a Freedom of Information request. Since her time there, she has had night terrors and long-term mental health issues. She has relied on medication throughout most of her life. Later in the 1970s, the United States, the MKUltra experiments and documents would become public, and with that, it was revealed that they had some help conducting these experiments on the Canadian side of the border. Lana was one of many who had been tortured under the secret MKUltra project, funded by the Canadian government. Allan Memorial Institute opened in 1943 inside of a mansion called Ravenscraig on the slopes of Mount Royal. Ravenscraig was one of the largest private homes in Montreal. At the time, it was built in the 1860s for Sir Hugh Allan, who was one of the largest shipping magnates. The place had more than 70 rooms, a ballroom, a conservatory, and a tower that overlooked the city and the river. After Allan's death, the property eventually went to the Royal Victoria Hospital, which then turned it into a psychiatric facility connected to McGill University. When the institute launched, it was promoted as a shift away from the locked-in ward model that most psychiatric hospitals had used. So that meant that the idea was the building was to operate without barred windows or locked doors, meaning that patients could move freely throughout the space, more so than in a traditional institute. It introduced one of the first psychiatric day hospitals in North America as well, so people could come in for treatments during the day and then go home at night. The focus was on treating acute psychological issues right away instead of keeping patients in long-term confinement. All right, for a quick second, let's hop over to the US of A. It is the spring of 1953, and the military is watching these films that are coming out of the Korean War. You have American soldiers sitting in front of cameras, and they are reading these scripted statements where they praise communism. They are admitting to war crimes that the military says never happened. The military officials look at these men on the screen, and they notice that the men are speaking in flat, mechanical tone voices. They see that these soldiers do not blink normally, and their expressions are completely blank, like they're acting under hypnosis. When Allan Dulles looks at the 1949 footage of Colonel Joseph Mainzetti, he sees the exact same vacant stares and rigid postures. And their take from this is that officials believe the Soviet Union is using a combination of unknown drugs, specialized psychological torture, and hypnosis to erase a prisoner's free will and instill a new set of beliefs. They also think that the United States is completely defenseless against a weapon that can force any American citizen or politician to betray their country without even knowing it. So on April 13, 1953, Dulles signs the paperwork that starts Project MKUltra to counter this specific threat. The purpose of the project is to duplicate and surpass what they believe the Soviets are doing in those films. They start looking for a chemical substance that can break down a person's psychological defenses during an interrogation, or truth serum, which directly connects to preventing American prisoners from being manipulated like the soldiers in Korea. At the same time, they want to master the technique of blanking out a mind entirely, so they can insert a completely different personality into a subject, creating an agent who can carry out missions and have no memory of it afterwards. Next, we need to talk about a very specific figure, Dr. Ewen Cameron. He spends the 1930s working at a mental hospital in Brandon, Manitoba, before moving to Albany Medical College in New York. During those years, he focuses his research on how the brain retains information, and he becomes obsessed with the physical mechanics of human memory. He writes essays where he argues that the standard psychiatric treatments are completely useless because they rely on listening to a patient's past. In Cameron's mind, a person who cannot handle the stress of modern life is a weak responder who threatens the efficiency of the workforce. He starts lecturing that psychiatrists should stop acting like listeners and should start acting like social engineers who have a duty to force these individuals to conform to society. Doesn't he sound like a treat? He forms this theory that memory is simply a physical track in the brain. He believes that if a person's thoughts are broken, a doctor should not be trying to fix their problems through conversation. Instead, he develops an idea that medicine needs to find a direct, physical way to smash those existing memory tracks entirely, because breaking down the old mind is the only way to build a completely compliant, productive citizen. In short, he wants to erase a person's past, which is essentially what makes them them, and reintroduce new ideas to them, creating a new personality. In 1953, McGill University in Montreal is looking to establish a brand new psychiatric department, and they receive a massive financial donation from the Rockefeller Foundation specifically to fund it. So the university buys the old Ravenscraig estate on Mount Royal to house the facility. This is where the Allan Memorial Institute comes into place. The university trustees want a strong leader with an international reputation to build this department from the ground up, and they look at Cameron's work down in Albany. They see a man who's publishing heavily, climbing the ranks of the medical establishment, and pushing for a modern, aggressive approach to mental health. So they offer him the dual role of chairman of the psychiatric department at McGill and the very first director of the Allan Memorial Institute. Cameron accepts the position and moves his family to Montreal in the summer of 1943 to take over the Allan Memorial Institute. The university gives him total administrative authority over the facility, allowing him to hire his own staff, design the training programs, and implement his theories about social engineering on a much larger scale than before. In short, this man was let off the leash. In January 1957, Sidney Gottlieb launches subproject 68 under the MKUltra umbrella, specifically allocating $69,000 over several years to subsidize the research. The CIA funnels this money through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology to ensure the agency's name is completely kept off the official papers. The Society contacts Cameron and offers to fund a study under the title of Behavioral Research, and Cameron signs the contract because his massive intake of drugs, custom isolation gear, and high-voltage equipment is becoming too expensive for the McGill University to maintain alone. The contract Cameron signs outlines a specific 4-step medical protocol designed to systematically dismantle the human mind. Once the money clears, he initiates his de-patterning program on patients, moving them through a deliberate cycle of physical and psychological trauma. The first phase is drug-induced sleep. Cameron uses an aggressive cocktail of heavy sedatives combining clorazepam, barbiturates, and insulin to put patients into artificial comas. Unlike standard medical sedation, this sleep state is maintained continuously for anywhere from 15 to 75 days, not hours, days. Patients are completely incapacitated, waking up only briefly for meals or bathroom breaks while remaining heavily disoriented. While the patients are in this prolonged twilight state, Cameron begins the intensive electric shock therapy. In standard psychiatry during the 1950s, a doctor would administer a single dose of 110 volts, lasting a fraction of a second, a few times a week. Cameron, however, destroys this medical standard by using a custom machine to deliver a sequence of up to 6 consecutive shocks, multiple times a day. He jacks up the electrical current to 30 and 40 times the normal power. And because these massive voltages cause violent epileptic seizures that can literally snap human bones, his staff injects patients with paralytic muscle relaxants to keep them completely immobilized on the tables. I mean, I guess the only saving grace is that they're technically in comas and aren't awake while experiencing this horrific physical torment. He continues this daily blistering of the brain until the patient reaches a state of total regression, where they lose the ability to speak, forget their own names, and even lose control of basic bodily functions. Once the old personality is successfully erased into a childlike blank slate, Cameron transitions the patient into the psychic driving phase. He locks custom-made football helmets onto the patient's head or wires speakers directly into their pillow. For 16 hours a day over consecutive weeks, the speakers blast looped audio recordings of voices repeating highly distressing, personalized phrases taken from the patient's intake interviews. The tapes would repeat lines like, "You're a bad mother," or "You're a failure," on a loop 250,000 times, drilling into the patient's subconscious. To make sure that the brain cannot latch onto reality, the entire process is paired with a strict sensory isolation. This means that patients were moved into dark, soundproof boxes with their hands wrapped in thick padding to eliminate their sense of touch. Imagine just a constant bombardment of your personal failures, your marital problems, or deep-seated fears. He was forcing them to accept a broken, complaintive state of mind. Once the patient was completely broken down, Cameron switches the recording to positive audio loops. These tapes repeated instructions on how they must think, feel, and behave from that moment on. The phrases command the patient to be dynamic, to be a productive worker, to love their family, or to comply with authority without any question whatsoever. He's trying to force install a completely new predictable personality template. They were left in dark for weeks at a time, completely cut off from any sight, sound, or human contact, forcing the brain to focus entirely on the looped audio messages. After the audio driving is complete, Cameron administers one final 7 to 10 day period of continuous chemical sleep to lock in new behavioral patterns in place. The immediate physical reality for these patients is that they are now completely regressed to a childlike state. When they open their eyes, they have zero coordination. They can't stand up or walk without support, and many have lost the physical ability to even swallow food or feed themselves. Because of the massive, repeated electroshock currents that blast through their brains while they were sedated, they suffer from double incontinence. They have completely lost control of their bladders and bowels, and nurses at the Allan Memorial Institute have to physically diaper adult patients and teach them how to use the bathroom all over again. And the mental side effects are just as severe. Patients wake up with total retrograde amnesia. They have no idea what year it is, what city they're in, or why they're lying in a hospital bed. When their family members come into the room, the patients look right at their husbands, wives, or children, and they have no idea who they are. Sometimes the patients are completely mute, staring blankly at the wall, while others suffer from severe organic anxiety and physical panic attacks as their brains try to process the total loss of their identity. While the severe physical and mental destruction of a patient is thoroughly documented, tracking the exact number of deaths inside the Allan Memorial Institute is a much more complicated matter. Because Cameron and his staff controlled all of the medical records, they rarely listed his extreme procedures as the official cause of death when a patient died on the table or inside of the ward. In the official hospital logs, when a patient's body gave out, the staff recorded the cause of death as natural or standard complications like heart failure or pneumonia. The nature of these experiments is recorded onto the paperwork. In internal files, researchers have identified individuals, like a patient recorded only as patient 11, who physically died while actively undergoing the depatterning protocol. I mean, look at the patients who were forced into continuous chemical sleep. The physical toll was lethal. Cameron's records show that patients routinely lost massive amounts of weight, sometimes over 13 pounds in a single month, because their bodies were breaking down under the constant sedation and the lack of proper nutrition. The prolonged comas frequently triggered severe fatal respiratory infections like hypostatic pneumonia because the patients were kept completely immobile in their beds for weeks at a time.
You. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing, it's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you. Let's take a moment during this break to talk about something that matters. Something that doesn't get to be background noise. The Anishinaabe-Moan word, Ni-ki-na-gana, means we are all related, and we are. But relationship isn't just about words, it's about responsibility. Canadian author Naomi Klein once said, "It is not enough to say that we live on Indigenous land. We have to act as if we do." And one way to do that is by supporting Pay Your Rent, a grassroots mutual aid initiative that offers direct material support to Indigenous organizers across this land. It's not charity, it's rent. For those of us who aren't Indigenous to this place, it's a way to show up differently, to redistribute some of what's been taken. The Pay Your Rent Fund started as a one-time request for help in 2018 and grew into a nonprofit called Ni-ki-na-gana. Your monthly or one-time donation can help provide food, hygiene supplies, housing support, and resources for Indigenous-led resistance and community care. So if you've ever said, "We're all related," ask yourself, are you being a good relative? Visit payyourrent.ca and find out more about how you can be part of something better. Now, back to this case.
The torture, of course, didn't end just inside the walls of the Institute. For patients who managed to survive the comas and electric shock and were sent home, the treatments did cut their lives short. The massive voltages from repeated electric shock sessions put an incredible amount of stress on the patient's cardiovascular systems. And families of the survivors later detailed how their loved ones suffered massive, debilitating heart attacks and strokes shortly after leaving the Institute, which they directly attributed to the trauma of the treatments. When families came back to the Allan Memorial Institute to pick up their relatives, they were completely unprepared for what walked out of the ward. They had dropped off a spouse or a parent who was suffering from something manageable like postpartum depression, anxiety, or even just a pinched nerve, expecting a standard medical recovery, and instead, the doctors hand over a person who is physically and mentally unrecognizable. The initial reaction of these families is just pure horror and confusion. They look at their loved ones and they find adults who can no longer perform basic tasks like tying their shoes, feeding themselves, or using the bathroom without assistance. In many cases, the patients look directly at their own children and spouses with blank stares, no memories of who they are. When Julie Taney's father returned home after 3 months of treatments, his young children found a man who was completely detached and emotionally vacant. A stark contrast from the active father who used to build skating rinks for them in the backyard. As the weeks turn into years, the families realize that the person they knew is gone permanently, and the home environment breaks down under the weight of the constant care required for these regressed adults. Daughters and sons describe growing up with parents who sit alone in dark rooms for hours, completely stripped of their emotions. The trauma becomes entirely generational. Families split up, marriages collapse under the financial and emotional strain, and some children end up being placed in foster care because the surviving parent can't manage both a shattered spouse and a household. By January 1963, a CIA inspector named John Vance conducts an internal audit of the entire MKUltra program, and he singles out the work at the Allan Memorial Institute. Vance and the agency officials conclude that Cameron's experiments are not only medically worthless for espionage, but they are also incredibly dangerous to the agency's secrecy. They realize that if the public or the Canadian government ever sees the physical state of these patients, the blowback would completely destroy the CIA. Cameron's funding is officially pulled later that year, entirely because the researchers decided that the physical damage was too messy and the dream of the programmable super spy is a failure. Speaking of the Canadian government, how did they play into this? Back in 1954, before the CIA formally set up Subproject 68, Cameron applies for medical grants through the Canadian Department of National Health and Welfare. The federal government approves his request and begins filtering thousands of dollars to the Allan Memorial Institute through the Dominion Provincial Health Research Grants. This means that while the CIA is secretly funneling cash through their front organization to test mind control techniques, the Canadian taxpayers are simultaneously footing the bill for the exact same medical equipment and drug cocktails. When the CIA pulls its funding in 1963, the Canadian government does not stop their operation. Instead, federal officials keep their own grants active, allowing Cameron to continue his aggressive depatterning and psychic driving experiments on patients for another full year until he finally resigns from the institute in 1964. Decades later, when the internal Cooper Report investigations happened in the 1980s, the official line from Ottawa is that the government officials were not fully aware of the horrific extent of Cameron's experiments. But the paper trail confirms that the Canadian state actively financed the infrastructure that kept the ward running. I mean, ignorance is bliss, but how much of it was actually ignorance? And to see exactly how these experimental protocols destroyed an individual's life, you can look at the story of a young mother named Jean Steele. Jean is a young mother when she is admitted to the Allan Memorial Institute in 1957. She has recently given birth and is experiencing severe postpartum depression, so her family sends her to the facility expecting standard psychiatric help. Instead, Cameron selects her for the full depatterning protocol. He places her in a continuous drug-induced coma that lasts for weeks at a time. While she is completely incapacitated, the staff administrators give high-voltage electric shock treatments multiple times a day, cranking the electrical currents way past the regular medical standards. Because of the massive shock triggers violent physical convulsions, the nurses inject her with muscle relaxants to keep her body flat on the table while her brain is repeatedly blasted. Once her memory is stripped away, the staff place headphones on her ears and play loops of audio recordings for 16 hours a day while she is locked in a sensory isolation room. The tape loops negative, distressing phrases thousands of times to break whatever is left of her psychological defenses. When the drugs are finally stopped and Jean wakes up, she is completely devastated. She doesn't know who she is. She can't walk. She's lost control of her bladder and bowel. She has zero memory of her husband or her newborn daughter, Allison. When the family brings her home, they quickly realize the woman they knew is gone. Jean spends the rest of her days living in a state of severe chronic trauma. Her daughter describes growing up in a house where Jean is sitting entirely alone in the dark room for hours, completely vacant and detached from reality. She becomes obsessed with writing, filling notebooks, and scratching frantic, repetitive codes and geometric patterns onto the walls of the house, while trying to process a mind that was physically broken apart in Montreal. Or let's look at Velma Orlecow, whose case completely changed the public's understanding of what was happening in Montreal. In the late 1950s, Velma was a young mother living in Winnipeg, married to David Orlecow, who is climbing the ranks of Canadian politics. She is struggling with mild routine depression and decides to check into the Allan Memorial Institute because it's considered the most prestigious psychiatric hospital in the country. Instead of receiving standard therapy care, she is immediately placed under Cameron's direct supervision, and he selects her for his chemical experimentation program. Without her informed consent or knowledge, the staff begins administering massive, reoccurring doses of LSD, sometimes forcing her to take the drug up to 14 times in a single testing block. High-dosage sessions, Velma is subjected to intense psychological pressure while experiencing severe, terrifying hallucinations. The doctors lock her into an isolation room while the drugs are active, monitoring her panic attacks and psychological distress to see how a chemical substance can break down a person's cognitive defenses. When she is finally discharged and returns to Winnipeg, her mental health is completely shattered. She suffers from chronic, debilitating anxiety, permanent memory gaps, and violent flashbacks that prevent her from ever fully returning to her normal life. Decades later, when the CIA's involvement in the Institute is exposed, Velma refuses to stay silent. In 1980, she joins forces with a small group of fellow survivors and launches a historic, multi-million-dollar lawsuit directly against the CIA in Washington, D.C. federal court. Despite the American government's intense efforts to suppress the evidence and throw the case out, Velma's political connections and relentless public testimonies forced the CIA to settle out of court in 1988, marking the first time the agency is legally forced to pay financial compensation to victims of its covert mind control program. And back to Lana, the legal avenues that she is pursuing right now is a direct response to the reality that the Canadian government and hospitals have avoided accountability for decades. While the American courts block survivors from suing the U.S. government by ruling that the CIA falls outside of Canadian jurisdiction, Lana has focused her legal strategy entirely on the domestic institutions that allowed the Allan Memorial Institute to operate in the first place. Lana stepped forward as one of the primary named plaintiffs to file a class action lawsuit in the Quebec Supreme Court. The legal claim does not just ask for financial damages. It targets the entire infrastructure behind the Montreal experiments, specifically naming McGill University, the Royal Victorian Hospital, and the Government of Canada as the defendants. The core of her legal argument is that these institutions engaged in unlawful human experimentation on civilians who never gave informed consent. The institutional response to her lawsuit has been a series of aggressive legal maneuvers to get the case thrown out of court. The lawyers representing the Royal Victoria Hospital have filed an immediate appeal to stop her momentum, but a Quebec judge denied the hospital's motion, clearing the way for the trial to proceed. The Canadian government has also tried to dodge the lawsuit by pointing back to the small, out-of-court settlement that they offered to a fraction of victims back in 1992. But those early payments required survivors to sign away their rights without the state ever admitting legal liability or issuing a public apology. Lana's legal team is pushing forward to establish an official, binding judgment of guilt in an open courtroom. At 84 years old, Lana is using this specific class action lawsuit to ensure that the remaining survivors and their descendants are legally recognized before the clock runs out. As for Cameron, as the experiments continue to fracture families across Canada, Cameron's career at the Allan Memorial Institute starts to unravel behind closed doors. By 1964, professional pushback and rumors about his extreme depatterning methods are mounting within the medical community, and he abruptly resigns from his position 4 years before his contract is officially set to expire. He packs up his things and returns to Albany, New York, completely cutting off ties with the Montreal facility. He spends his remaining years trying to rebuild his legacy by conducting basic research on aging and memory far away from the military programs. On September 8th of 1967, while hiking a mountain in New York with his son, Cameron suffers a sudden and fatal heart attack. He dies at 66 years old, completely isolated from any legal consequences because the public won't find out about the CIA's funding or true nature of his work until the first Freedom of Information Act disclosures are made a decade later. For Lana and the surviving families, his death means the man who ordered the treatments will never have to sit in a courtroom and answer for what happened in those wards. And finally, as for the CIA, in late 1972, President Richard Nixon tells CIA Director Richard Helms that he's being replaced. Helms knows that he is on his way out of the agency, and he realizes that he is one of the only people in Washington who actually knows the full scoop of what Sidney Gottlieb was doing with the mind control program. To avoid massive public outrage and ensure that no one within the agency faces criminal prosecution for the human experiments, Helms meets with Gottlieb, and the two men agree to completely purge the paperwork. In January of 1973, Helms issues the official order to destroy all records tied to Project MKUltra. The chief of the CIA Records Center balks at the command, flatly refusing to destroy the documents. So Ghibli drives out to the storage facility in person and forces the order. Over the explicit written protests of the facility's archivist, Gottlieb oversees the shredding of boxes containing over 2 decades of progress reports, laboratory data, and patient lists, leaving behind a massive gap in the historical record. The purge is incredibly successful, but it's not entirely perfect. Years later, when investigators try to piece the story together, they discover that thousands of pages escaped the shredder simply because they were misfiled in a separate financial depot under budgetary and fiscal titles instead of the project names. While these surviving financial receipts allowed investigators to prove that the funding existed, the destruction of the core files means that the exact identity of hundreds of victims and the full extent of what happened to them are completely gone. The true scope of the project went to the shredders. leaving families to sift through fragments, trying to fill in the blanks of their own lives. Lana Pointing and other survivors are left carrying memories that aren't entirely theirs, shaped by forces that officially try to erase themselves from the map. It leaves you wondering about the pieces that didn't get misfiled, the names and the dates and the specific combination of chemicals that were forced into those rooms. They now exist only in the quiet spaces of minds that they broke. The institution still stands, the files are gone, and the people who survived are left to prove the reality of a nightmare that the paperwork says never happened. Thanks for joining me on this eerie journey through Canada's darker corners. If you love this episode of Canadian Creepies, be sure to follow Valerie on Instagram and TikTok at Canadian Creepies. She's the one behind the socials, sharing behind-the-scenes stories, creepy photos, and sneak peeks of upcoming episodes. And if you're craving even more haunted history and twisted folklore, be sure to check out my other podcast, Down the Crooked Path. You can follow the show on Instagram and TikTok for even more haunted history, mythical madness, and spine-tingling storytelling. Come say hi, share your own creepy encounters, and help us keep the weird alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay creepy.